Welcome back. Thank you for attending this session. This morning we discussed about different facets of the role of private security in international relations. We discussed about malign actors. We discussed about responsible actors. And we did not discuss so much about those affected, okay? The people who need humanitarian assistance, and those who are providing this humanitarian assistance and their interactions with the humanitarian actors. So we've heard from some of you, from private security managers, that they have contracts with the UN, for instance. We've heard about the impact that malign actors may have, human rights abuses or violations of international humanitarian law. This afternoon we have kind of here a community of concern, I would say. We've bring together a group of people who have been all working on this issue of the humanitarian impact, but also the humanitarian engaging and negotiations with private military companies, mostly. We had this discussion on terminology. I don't want to reopen this conversation, but a lot will be about the impact of military actors, military contractors, mercenaries during this discussion. And we will look at the impact they have, and we'll look at how humanitarian actors negotiate with them. And this panel is also composed of people who are looking for answers, creating a community of practice as well, not only a community of concern, but also researching on how best to influence those actors. So we are very lucky to have you all, and I think we should turn this group into a permanent working group. There is another dimension we are going to discuss, because the humanitarian actors are also very often exposed to risks themselves. And over the course of the last 2 decades, they have been using more and more private security contractors to protect their warehouses, to protect their staff. So private security actors are also now part, very often, of the humanitarian setup in the field. This is an evolution which took place over the years, perhaps without people noticing, but humanitarian actors are also the clients of private security companies. And we'll also discuss this question: how do humanitarian actors contract private security companies? And that will be also an important part of our conversation. So the impact of private military actors, the humanitarian consequences, the negotiations, but also the contracting of private security by humanitarian actors. For this, we have a great panel. So first, I'd like to introduce Yuri, who will speak first. He's part of the OCHA Humanitarian Negotiation Unit. You'll find his bio on this booklet, so I won't go into details. Yuri came to us and precisely in order to involve ICoCA in this work that they do to reflect on negotiation with private military actors. Then we will have Béatrice Godefroy, who is well known at ICoCA because she was a member of the board of directors until recently, and she worked for many years at Civic, supervising this report on the protection of civilians and private military actors. And she's today the policy engagement director at the Climate Action Accelerator in Geneva. Welcome. Then we have Patrick Vilailec, who is working with the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation, brings lots of experience of humanitarian work in the field, and he's the operation manager for the Africa region, and he has been working specifically on negotiations with private military actors. We have Dave Michalski, who is working currently for Sahan, which is a consultancy based in Nairobi. It's a research institute. And Dave is also bringing lots of experiences from all over the world. We met during humanitarian missions like more than 20 years ago. He's been working with MSF for a long time. He was advisor to the president of MSF for 8 years. And specifically, he researched on negotiations with private military actors. And finally, we have a member of a ICoCA member company, IDG. So we are very happy to have you, Greg, because actually you're bridging the gap between the private security and the humanitarian sector. You've been working in security for your career, your entire career, both in the humanitarian sector and now with a private security company. So you'll be able to somehow bridge the gap between those different worlds. Or try to. Thank you very much, and I would like now to give the floor to Yuri for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot for inviting. So I think it's important to start my presentation with quickly explaining what I do and what we do in my unit. We work in the humanitarian negotiations unit, and our primary goal and we are predominantly focused on supporting the leadership on the strategical and operational level in their engagement with parties that affect humanitarian operations. So we utilize the humanitarian diplomacy efforts to achieve humanitarian objectives, generally to have positive impact, humanitarian impact on the ground. So my particular role involves working on PMCs, rather on a more strategical level, and I serve as the OCHA internal focal point on PMCs. So with this being said, it's really important to indicate when we work, where and when we get involved. Because there is misconception that PMCs is something new, that it's an actor just that appeared several years ago, which in fact it's not. It has been present in many of the conflict zones or contexts that we were working before. It's most of the time they are there, whether we know that or not. And in some instances, their effect in humanitarian operations is quite negligible. We don't see that, and they don't affect humanitarian operations. They don't affect the populations in need. So we don't pay attention to that. There are contexts, as it was just mentioned, where the PMCs are actually enabling humanitarian operations. They provide services as logistics or transportation or safety and security. Whereas, of course, there are contexts where these actors impede humanitarian operations. They have a significant effect, especially, again, in recent years, we have seen this being circulated, and there are specific groups that have a really negative effect in many contexts around the world. It's also important to indicate that the same actor or the same group will have different modalities of operations in different contexts. So by saying this, I'm trying to build a parallel, because PMCs is not equal evil. So they can support humanitarian operations. They can affect humanitarian operations. So my particular unit, we work together with several other entities in OCHA. These are colleagues based in Istanbul, CMCS, Civil Military Coordination Service, and our colleagues in New York, PUBS. And in many projects, we work together. But it's really important to indicate we work when things are negative. We don't look into the positive aspects. We look when the PMCs are affecting humanitarian operations. And this is the only intervention. This is when we actually start supporting. So, another really important thing, I also wanted to mention that we don't really look into the modalities of employment of these companies. We don't look into contractual obligations. We look when they affect humanitarian actors or the populations in need. Everything else, I think ICoCA would be a better place to explain the contractual obligations and hiring process and vetting process for these actors on the ground. Another thing that we keep continuing repeating is that PMCs should not be considered as some kind of new actor with a different modality. It's like any other actor which is applicable to our context, and we are encouraging humanitarian actors and our staff to treat them as they would treat any other actor that would be applicable to their context, as any other armed group or government or non-government entity. So if they are applicable to humanitarian access, they have to be engaged, because, again, during the last couple of years we've seen that there is a quite indication that these groups are perceived in absolutely different ways as something unique and hard to approach. Still, with this being said, PMCs are extremely different. I mean, it was just mentioned that we're not even clear on the clear definitions. Do we Do we consider PSCs as PMCs or PMCs as PSCs, or are they absolutely different groups? So internally, we decided to divide them in 3 major groups just to make our internal perception and building the strategy of engaging these groups. We divided them in 3 groups. The first group is considered purely for-profit organizations, basically the PMCs that are falling. Basically, they are there for the money, and they are interested to have as many clients as possible. And what is interesting that these actors are the easiest to engage, and these are actors, well, based on the data we have, are the easiest to, let's say convince to not do specific things that affect humanitarian operations. Simply because actors that are financially motivated, they're interested to have as many clients as possible, and that for them it's important to have a clean track record. So these organizations would be focused on having, well, be available in their market and not be involved in incidents of human rights violations or affecting humanitarian operations. The second group, which is absolutely opposite the first, we call them politically motivated. And while the groups are still motivated by financial incomes most of the time, the groups generally have one client, and the client perceives certain political objective in the context they are operating. And the problem with these groups is that they generally have a little or no open channel of communication. So it's really hard to, first of all, to reach the group or their client, and the client would generally be reluctant to admit any connections with this group. So it makes it's really difficult for us to engage with this group and negotiate specific humanitarian objectives. And the third group, the third type, it's a bit unique one, because it's generally perceived as a part of a bigger enterprise that has specific interests in the context. So let's think of it as more as a security group extension within a company operating in a certain area. They have the same client all the time because they basically belong to their mother company. They're quite easy to approach, but changing their modalities of operation sometimes is quite difficult. But it's still really important to understand that the impact that PMCs have on the ground to our operations generally depends on the capacity these PMCs are deployed on, who is their client, what are their objectives, also the number, how many are there, because there are contexts where we know specific PMCs are present, but we cannot really, we don't see them, we don't know them, and they don't really have effect. It's also important that there are specific things that we're trying to adjust internally. Again, we're emphasizing the fact that PMCs are as any other actor, and they have to be approached. And we're trying to remove this myth of PMCs being unique, although as any other actor, they have their unique capabilities. But it's for humanitarian access perspective, they're all more or less the same. It just depends the way we will work with them. So, and as long as it's for humanitarian objectives, we can do that, and there's nothing that would stop us from doing this. Internally, we work on several work streams, and generally we're just trying to make sure that there is a clear understanding of this new, let's say, popular actor, and that there is a clear understanding how to engage them in the first place. So we developed several internal FAQs. We were in touch with ICoCA colleagues to actually understand what challenges they are facing, how they interact with the actors. And we worked with many other entities. Some of them are actually present in the room on the same topic. So I think my 10 minutes are coming to the end. So just to summarize what I was trying to say is that PMCs from humanitarian engagement perspective are not unique actor. They need to be engaged, and they have to be engaged. The engagement, though, has to be, they should not be engagement for the sake of engagement. There should be clear objectives why this is happening and the clear humanitarian goals that want to be reached. There should be a lot of planning and preparation, and this is what we encourage our colleagues to do and our teams that we're advising, that especially engage in the groups that are known or are reportedly accused of violating human rights or conducting specific actions should be extremely careful and well prepared. But however, this is not something that would prevent us from engaging these actors. Thank you. That's it from my side.
I think, yes, it works. So thank you very much, Yuri. Now I'd like to give the floor to Beatrice for your 10 minutes. As you wish, as you wish.
I can stay here. Does it work? Yeah? Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much, Vincent and the ICoCA, for inviting me to this panel. It's a real pleasure to be back to the ICoCA family. So I'm here actually indeed to speak about a topic that was dear to my heart when I was at ICoCA and when I was working as Europe Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict until recently, which was establishing the link between the protection of civilians or impact to civilian protections of the presence and activities of private military contractors in conflict countries. So really looking at this from a physical protection perspective. And before just entering into some of the findings and some of the elements that we reviewed in this, that we analyzed in this report, I'd like to pay a tribute actually to my colleague Emmanuel Diel, who authored the report and performed the research, as well to colleagues from Center for Civilians in Conflict, who are actually carrying the torch of this topic now that I'm gone. Maybe starting with protection of civilians, which might not be a familiar concept with all of you. Protection of civilians can mean everything and nothing. It's a very large word. My specific perspective here is looking at physical protection. So basically how civilians can be victims of physical harm as they are being affected by military operations. So it can be linked to the presence or linked to the activities of security actors. And so looking at this from the civil society angle, we're looking at how we can engage and have a dialogue with security actors on the ground so that they have training, capacity building, guidance, doctrine, let's say in general a larger understanding and prioritization of how civilians are being affected by conflicts in the way they are doing operations. So it means how do they integrate civilians in threat assessments, in operational guidance, in planning of military operations, in the way they monitor military operations, in how they track civilian casualties, in the way they improve their operations. So I'm having this engagement already with conventional armed forces from some of the states which are, I think, represented in this room, as well as a variety of states across the world, is extremely challenging, as you can imagine. And so when we come to PMCs, it's another ball game. So the report actually that we did with Emmanuel was really looking at what are the specific obstacles to preventing, minimizing, and addressing civilian harm when we're actually faced with private military contractors. And I don't want to reopen that conversation of definitions, etc. After also long conversations with ICoCA, and thank you, Jamie, for being such an expert on this topic, we decided really to stick to private military contractors because it's really how civilians are affected by the conduct of hostilities here. Okay, and so what did we found? And apologies if I look at my note, I'm just back from COP, so I'm trying to to cope with the transition. So we did a case studies on, so it was the research was performed in 21-22 on CAR, Mozambique, Libya, and also a historical case study for Iraq. And the sort of, and it was super interesting to hear from you the typology actually you're doing in terms of the PMCs or PMSCs. But indeed also we were looking not only at Wagner, but really at the larger presence of Emirati companies, Turkish companies, of course Russian, Chinese, etc., but also local ones, as they are related to international companies. And what we found consistently was that the presence and activities of PMCs was affecting civilians in massively on the ground with specific patterns. They were affected by military operations, air operations, and ground operations, which was a surprise to us to find cases, of course, of incidents of civilian harm arising from air operations from PMCs. was the case, for instance, in Mozambique. The list is really long, but injury and death caused by IEDs and booby traps or other explosive remnants of war. A really important trend which is overrepresented for PMCs is sexual assault and abuse, or CRSV, conflict-related sexual-based violence, excessive use of force, enforced disappearances, interruption of or damage to critical infrastructure, threat or intimidation to communities and or individuals consistently across the countries and the case studies we have researched. And the last one is displacement. So it's a long list, which is again really very similar to trends that we have of misbehavior from security actors in different contexts, but with a strong emphasis on the first elements that I mentioned, including sexual abuse and CRSV. And just in a few minutes that I have, I just want to highlight, so what does it mean then in terms of what I mentioned initially? How do you engage actually with those actors to improve civilian harm when the patterns are so strong and when these actors are so special, let's say, not to say complex? Well, one obstacle is when you address abuses, violation, incidents of civilian harm, you want to, of course, establish responsibility and attribution. These actors, and especially the states that contract them, let's say, use them in a number of situations in a covert manner, and therefore use the plausible deniability sort of card, meaning that they deny responsibility or even knowledge of possible misconduct. So this is a really strong obstacle when you want to then work on improving the situation. Second, and that's really a strong obstacle as well, there is insufficient data available. When so the few official, let's say, organizations which collect data, and the UN are one of them, especially the Human Rights Office and UN integrated missions, not all of them today actually have disaggregated data, so you would have reporting on civilian casualties, but you actually don't know whether the civilian casualties are attributed or could be attributed to PMC or not, or mercenary, etc. Let's say I'm saying private contractors, staff in general. So it's a serious sort of a problem to then moving forward with acting if they escape scrutiny. Third serious obstacle we found was threats to local organizations, local human rights organizations, media, journalists, any sort of researcher, basically anybody that is actually monitoring, gathering data or analysis on their activities on the ground and the impact on civilian protection. And that's actually, that's a finding that we had ourselves in our experience during the report. We had contacted over 16 key informants, and in the end we have 40 interviews that we could use, because we could see, based on the exposure to media, so international exposure or media attention, we could see the difficulty that we have, or that had those people, those informants on the ground in CAR, in Libya, etc., to actually not fear for their lives as they would be sharing information with us. For their lives or for the lives of the people who are actually their own sources on the ground. So not only are local communities affected by intimidation, but also human rights organizations. And but that can be for further discussion, but we have seen, of course, with the Ukraine war and how the things have been developing over the past 3 years, how hybrid and informational strategies or warfare is at play today. And of course, private contractors are a big, let's say, arm to use that weapon in a war, in a conflict context, but also to engage into a smear campaign and disinformation campaign against those local organizations, or against some of the data or analysis that they publish, making it even more complicated to have attribution. And I'm looking at Vincent. I guess I have one more minute. And just to say that maybe the last obstacle, I mean, there are many of them, but the last major obstacle is, of course, the frameworks, the national and regulatory frameworks. We know, I'm sure we have discussed this morning, the gaps in international regulations, etc., to actually being able to address violations caused by mercenaries or other categories of private or foreign fighters, let's say. But also, the gap is also in terms of national legislation. It really makes a difference if in the host country or the contracting states, or in the territorial country country or territorial state or let's say receiving state if they have a strong legislation guiding the presence and the activities of these contractors. And that's actually why we looked at the historical example or case study of Iraq, as we saw that, and I'm sure some of you, I'm looking at Dave and others, were deployed in Iraq maybe in the years 2003, 4, etc., and before the Nisour Square incident. And at that time, PMC or let's say private contractors as a whole could come in and out of the country without too much of a control, right? And the numbers were actually extremely important of contractors present in country. But we have seen that after the incident and sort of changes in frameworks and in agreements between, of course, the coalition and the Iraqi government, but also in terms of national Iraqi legislation, that the number of contractors present decreased significantly because of the sort of additional constraints that were posed, including prices actually for being operating in the country. So it's just to say, I've been, as I was, an ambassador also for ICoCA in a way, when I was a board member and discussing this point with states, Western states, other states, like, what can we do? It's at the end of the day, it's such a complicated, such a complex topic. International, let's say, multilateral initiative, dialogue, negotiations are not going really anywhere on this question. So what can we do? I'm like, there's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can do fixing your legislation, but there's a lot you can do in the way you cooperate with your security partners on the ground. So not only in the way, for instance, if you have military operations, in the way you design your security force assistance activities, but also in the way you influence and dialogue with your partners. And in terms of or building their capacity to change the legislation and have a stronger legislation on the ground. So this really makes a huge difference. So maybe at the last couple of points in terms of ways forward, I think, again, states can do a lot, as I just mentioned. They can do a lot as also being armed actors themselves. They need to reinforce the way they integrate threat assessments and the way they integrate the sort of private military contractors phenomenon in their threat assessments when they are looking at what threats civilians are exposed to before they design their military operations or security force assistance activities, etc., and that then they can integrate it. They need to be able to better protect civilians from every third-party threats. So that means also from private military contractors. And they need also to make sure that their own military partners on the ground, those that they train, that they provide assistance to, etc., that they also have all the provisions in place not to harm civilians and to, of course, be let's say, aware of threats to civilians that are linked to PMCs. And the last element, and I don't know if there are any donors in the room, I think, and I'm sure my colleagues, I mean, it's fantastic to have actually humanitarian actors who are going to speak to the efforts that they are doing to engage these sort of groups or security forces. But there really is the need to put much more emphasis, budgets and political support to local and international organizations who monitor and collect data. They need to be supported. They need to enhance their security frameworks for themselves, for their sources, for their families, as I was mentioning. And there is a huge challenge in data protection, data gathering, data storing, etc. So there's a lot that can be done as well from a state sort of / donor perspective to support these actors and help them to do the very, very difficult work that they find themselves in a position to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll come back to you later, and we'll also discuss the question of contracting that you know well from the role at ICoCA, contracting by humanitarian actors of private security providers. And I'd like to give the floor to Patrick. Patrick has been researching this topic of negotiation with PMCs, especially in Africa. That's your scope. So how do humanitarian actors negotiate with PMCs?
Thank you, Vincent. So actually, it's not. I'm not only working on negotiation with PMCs. I'm working on humanitarian negotiations in general in Africa region, Our organization has the focus to foster a community of practice, a professional network of humanitarians on the topic of negotiation. So it's quite wide. And if I would like to share with you a few messages that I have from my members. So we are about 6,000 humanitarians who join our organization. And I wanted to share with you a few messages related to when private military contractors, if you are one of them, meet humanitarians in the field and what is expected from the humanitarians. As I was preparing for the session, so I had a few calls, and I'm working on it for the past 2 years, but I had specifically a few calls in order to define what is really needed, from both sides. both sides. So first thing I want to say, for the humanitarians in Africa, our main challenges that we have and dilemmas in terms of negotiations are mainly focused on field security, insecurity, access to areas controlled by various armed groups, access to strengthening access to healthcare, for women, girls, etc., etc. I would say the usual, humanitarian work. Coming to the work or to the negotiation or engagement first with the private military companies, we see a large, I would say, diversity depending on each country. And this depends very much actually on how the company, the private military company, is contracted by the mandator, the government usually. And it differs very much from one country to another. If you take the example of Central African Republic, so I think the narrative there is very clear and open from the government, on how they work with private military contractors. And for the humanitarians there, I think the access is almost open. But this does not, unfortunately, prevent from those violations that you are talking about against population. So that's why, in a way, also humanitarians are very concerned on how to engage with those private military contractors, mainly Wagner, to name it. So because how will they be perceived after that in their field operations when they are seen engaging with those contractors? And here, there's one thing that is very important for most of the humanitarians when they want to engage with the private military contractors. It's a dilemma, actually. It's if you engage with the private military contractors, in any case, you will be perceived in a way, as associated to those contractors, to one side of the party. And one of the basic principles and fundamental principles for the humanitarian actors is to maintain their neutrality in the midst of a conflict zone, most of the time. And so that's why there is this dilemma: do we engage or do we not engage? So that's one thing. The second part, what I think worries most of the humanitarians when talking about private military companies, it's any kind of blunders that can happen to the NGOs or to the humanitarians working in the field. What do I mean by that? And taking again the example of Central African Republic, there's been many security incidents involving private military companies, like taking the cars, looting some warehouses in the field, and it was somehow by mistake. So it was possible after that to retrieve the goods that were taken, but then it creates, of course, a certain trauma for the humanitarians. And then I'm not even talking about what happens to the population also. You mentioned that very well, in terms of protection of civilians. So that would be one of the examples I would give for Central African Republic. If I go now, one context that is very, I think, prominent these days is the Central Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In Mali, for example, engaging with the private military companies and engaging with Wagner actually in the field, that means when they are in operations, I think that it is now obvious that when you have a humanitarian operations, most of the time you have one of these military operations and together with the private militaries, right? And so how do they engage with them? So what I was told is that in that time, so that was a couple of years ago now, I think the situation has changed, but some years ago, if you would meet some of the Wagner contractors in the field, it was possible and like welcome to engage a dialogue with them if you go to Menaka, Mopti, etc., etc. I'm coming from different parts in the Liptako-Gourma. But now today, you know, there's also a narrative that has changed a lot in the Sahel, as everyone has followed, I'm sure. And now, you know, whether the Malian government or the Burkinabe government have a different narrative, you know, and their war, you know, and the way they lead their war, you know, leaves very little space for engagement directly from the humanitarians to the private military contractors. And this is something that you have to understand, that it creates some kind of fear, mystery, you know, unknown, you know, how you, as private military contractors, you work in the field. And then on the top of that, there are sometimes, you know, some blunders also that can be terrible, as you mentioned, and that creates, you know, an additional fear. So I think that one of the things that you know, not only the CCHN, but I think the humanitarian community tries to do, is to open those channels of communications with the private military contractors, whether is it at this level, or also at field level. If we talk at country level, now it will, as I said, it will depend very much on each country how it's open. And I will take the example of Eastern Congo, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where in this particular case you have one company that it was in the news. So it's called Agemira. So this company is providing support to the FRDC, the Congolese Armed Forces. And so I think here that what is probably more appreciated by the humanitarians is that there is more transparency. They know that the contract is open, you know, that there is a support, however it is. But then comes the question on how they are perceived by the population. And sometimes, you know, it's just a small thing that makes it more dramatic. So in Congo, in Goma, for example, so you see the soldiers or the contractors of Agemira, you see them in the city, but they are carrying their guns in the city for good reasons or not. But then how does it look from the civilian point of view? You know, to see them carrying guns and passing the checkpoints very quickly. When it's not fast enough, you know, you shoot a bit in the air so it goes faster. So that's what creates, I think, a lot of confusion for the humanitarians and the civilian populations. So I think that as, you know, conclusion, I don't want to take too much time, but I think that one of the requests from my network, from my colleagues, humanitarian colleagues, you know, it's what they are asking from the private military contractors, is that to have a more transparent, open communication with them, you know, and this will depend very much on your mandator, the government that has hired you, but to have this conversation through the official channel. You have OCHA as an official channel. You have different INGO platforms also that organize this coordination. Also to get to know probably more each other when you meet them in the operations, you know. You can meet one humanitarian organization very close to where you operate also, and how to reassure them in order to, you know, to make it less I would say scary for the humanitarians. I think that then on the part of the humanitarians, and they recognize it also, and that's what we've been trying to do for the past 2 years, there is a lack of knowledge on how what is exactly a private military company and how it works, and what is also the applicable legal framework. And that's why when I got in touch at the time with DCAF, so the other organization involved, so, you know, so it was a lot of work to explain the different legal framework that can apply and how it works also in relation with the mandator. So that's the main thing I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much.
Now moving to Dave. About humanitarian negotiation from a very operational perspective.
First of all, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. We were commenting up here about what a lovely room it is, and also the questions this morning from the people were just really interesting and dynamic and so forth. I won't repeat some of the things that have already been said. I think we as humanitarians, we have some things to overcome a bit, and that's what we are working on. One of them is with regards to private companies. There can be a bit of we have no problem to talk to the Taliban or to talk to American military, but there can be a bit of how can I say it? The private sector nature of this can be a barrier. We don't like doing stuff with private sector in some ways, so that has to be overcome. And so the other thing is, as it's becoming very clear, there's all kinds of PM, private military. It's like a wide variety, and their training level can be at a very wide variety, especially with regards to international humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions. In fact, it was my colleague here that taught me about this 20 years ago. But so we see a big diversity in the field with regards to that. I think ICoCA can really bring a lot to the humanitarian world in terms of vetting when we want to hire a company to protect certain assets, as warehousing or people or anything like that. And I think there's a huge value that can be played there. NGOs just don't have the skills for that, and so that's what I really would like to. Then it can really be a bit blurry. How do we approach at a checkpoint or whatever? What if there is just one private military contractor there, and he's training or the local army? So who should we approach? Should we approach the general of the local army, or should we approach this person? But I think we have to do it. We have to engage, and there is a reluctance at times to view the private military contractors within the humanitarian world, to view them as just another armed group. Sorry, I don't want to repeat some of the things, so bear with me here. Language is very important. A lot of these companies, they hire from their friends, and so you might get something like in the Middle East, where you run into an entire company that is Spanish speaking or Russian speaking, and so on. So there was a very successful NGO in terms of working with the Wagner Group, but they hired a guy that spoke Russian, and they had much greater and they kept him on for 2 or 3 years. So he developed a rapport and so forth that was important. And then the other thing with language is, as you've heard from like our industry, and every industry is like this, you end up getting your own jargon and your own terms. And so how do you speak? What diction are you using that will maybe not, that will maybe give greater results in explaining these things. So at the checkpoint, you know, sometimes it's about you want to go through the checkpoint, or what we sometimes forget is to educate on, well, what if your mother was sick? Wouldn't you want her to be able to get through this checkpoint and get to the hospital to get some health care? Rather than talking about negotiated access or whatever, bring it down to a much more human level and so forth. And I think that has given positive results for us. The behavior can vary tremendously, and it can also change with a new commander or a rotation of the troops. It can change a lot. So that's why you need to keep continuously engaging. And in fact, one of the complaints from some of the guys I interviewed that work for these companies is saying, well, like, you have a big rotation in the staffing of the humanitarian groups, and we have one too. So it's very like it's a traditional problem that is complained about are these rotations, but they're happening concurrently with both the PMCs and the humanitarian actors. The other thing is, if you're going to negotiate, you need to spend the resources. And, you know, I think there's a realization of this, just if you look at the positions of the people, that now we need, networking costs money, and not all the smaller NGOs can afford to do that. So we go back a bit to resources and donors and that sort of thing. I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, definitely language is important, how you speak to people, and to bring it back down to a very human level, I think has really yielded some results for us. So I'll leave it there, and we'll bring the next person up. Thanks very much.
So now, yes, please, Greg, your turn. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. It's a real exciting topic to be discussing. I'm a little bit conscious that when I was asked to do this, that I was asked to represent and come up and discuss private security companies and the engagement of humanitarian actors with those. And this discussion for me is maybe turn a little bit more into into private military companies, and I'm not sure I'm so well geared up to talk about that, because I used to be a humanitarian negotiator. I used to go on front lines and talk with non-state armed actors and people who wanted to do bad things in the world. And my life, having left that and started working for a private security company, has become far less interesting and far more compliance-based and far more desk-based, as is the same, I imagine, with most of the industry colleagues in this room at the moment. So I apologise, but I'm probably going to bring this back down a notch and make it a far more boring conversation. But I do look forward to engaging on a slightly higher level after I've said my piece, at least. But and also apologies, because I'm probably going to be reading most of this, because I'm not very good at getting up and talking in front of people. But yeah, before delving into the complexities of engaging between humanitarian organisations and private security companies, I think it's important to underscore the fundamental importance of the ethical standards, responsible best practices, and adherence to international humanitarian, human rights, and labour laws. At IDG, which is the company that I work for, we take great pride in upholding the highest level of ethical standards. Currently, our primary client base includes humanitarian and development agencies, INGOs, and embassies. And we do not engage or hold any contracts with the extractive industries. Our company was founded with two clear aims in mind. One, to provide honest, ethical, and sustainable employment for Nepalese Gurkhas. And over the years, that's morphed into good jobs for good people. And the second thing was to offer security services to humanitarian development agencies. I acknowledge the negative perceptions that have been highlighted surrounding private security sector, and in particular what's been highlighted today with the private military sector, given the historical and recent poor practices from private military companies and mercenaries such as Wagner Group. However, I believe, and I'm sorry I am bringing up that conversation again, which I know we've had continuously throughout the last few days, but I believe it's absolutely crucial to distinguish between responsible, ethically minded and professionalised private security actors like IDG and other ICoCA members, industry members, and unethical private military companies and mercenaries. Whilst the former look to exploit, the latter, I should say, look to exploit, I want to be clear about that, look to exploit instability and contribute to chaos, often as deniable extensions to dangerous political agendas, or our primary focus is instead on improving security, adhering to rule of law, and supporting humanitarian and development agencies in accessing complex and conflict-affected environments. We also have a very clear, or in the locations which we operate, we have very clear rules of engagement set by our clients, and the majority of our staff do not bear arms. They don't carry weapons. All too often, unfortunately, humanitarian and development workers face threats of violence, often paying the highest price to deliver aid. We aim to assist in bolstering security to deter and prevent violence against aid workers and diplomats, ensuring they can reach the most vulnerable communities safely and build peace. And I do genuinely believe that humanitarian actors have a right to security. I emphasise the three pillars of security: acceptance, protection and deterrence. Whilst private security companies are not often or usually recognised for deterrence, our aim, and I believe much of the ICoCA industry members' aim, is actually to provide more comprehensive security solutions, focusing on developing acceptance among local populations and building relationships within communities to identify and reduce potential threats. These are also the populations in which the majority of our recruitment is done, meaning the maintenance of a strong organisational reputation is not only essential for winning business with new and existing clients, it is also paramount for building trust and relationships where we work. Regarding concerns about working conditions within private security industry, ICoCA members, or ICoCA industry members, I should say, including IDG, are committed to fair treatment, adequate training and ethical employment practices. However, broader industry challenges do still exist, and responsible practices in tender and contracting processes are crucial. Recent findings from ICoCA and the Global Interagency Security Forum highlight recommendations for improving contract practices by humanitarian and development clients. These include: 1, limited awareness and decision-making. Organisations must align contracting practices with humanitarian principles where possible, establishing clear policies, risk assessments and service specifications. 2, cost-driven selection. Security budgets, particularly relating to staffing, should be systematically included in proposals, and selection criteria beyond the cost should focus on standards and quality. 3, limited awareness of international standards. Prioritising compliance with international standards, with contracts including legal provision for duty of care responsibilities, misconduct and termination. 4, major risks entailed by private security contracting. Through risk assessments and human rights due diligence are crucial, thorough, not through, to prevent security, reputational and contractual risks. 5, poor working conditions and importance of relationships. Prioritising relationships with contracted personnel, provision of training, involvement in decision-making and ensuring fair salaries and improved working conditions. Humanitarian and development agencies, as major procurers of private security company services, play a pivotal role in ensuring high ethical standards in the procurement process. Ultimately, private security companies will respond to the stipulations set out by clients in their proposal documents. It is therefore imperative that the client sets the baseline for conditions they wish to see. These include the levels of compensation, living conditions, minimum insurance rates, working hours, all those areas which the clients would like to improve upon are within their scope to prescribe. This is particularly true in the countries whose labour laws are either non-existent or non-applicable. The endeavour to drive down prices also risks driving down quality, working conditions and trust. Too often, it's the most junior guard who suffers in what is a highly competitive market. This is where clients' perspectives can have the most impact on the living conditions of those tasked with their security. In conclusion, responsible engagement with private securities companies is shared responsibility. Collaboration among stakeholders, including private security companies, clients, governments and regulatory bodies, also the likes of ICoCA, is essential to drive positive change. By upholding ethical standards, promoting transparency and prioritising personnel well-being, we can contribute to a safer and more ethical private security landscape. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I'm excited for the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Greg, you mentioned that research carried out by the Global Interagency Security Forum and ICoCA a couple of years ago. Perhaps, Beatrice, you would like to add a word on this question of contracting in the humanitarian sector?
Yeah. Well, I think Greg already very eloquently highlighted some of the trends and the findings of this report that was done with the ICoCA. I think, I mean, especially as I was a humanitarian as well with MSF and others deployed on the ground. I think what's really interesting in this, for me, in this report, it really sort of mirrored some of the things I'd seen in the field, meaning that actually a large majority of the NGOs actually resort to private security companies. And these private security companies have very different shapes and forms. So it's really, I mean, thank you for what you said at the beginning. We really shouldn't put, I mean, we're not be putting apples and oranges, let's say, in the same basket. Because indeed, I've seen organizations contracting really the local organization, local staff, and very well known from the communities, etc., but also hiring higher either national or international organizations, I mean, private security providers. So it really, I mean, these are really very different sorts of organizations. And also in terms of the NGOs as well, so here we have, again, representatives from the UN, or you worked for MSF, which we were just discussing your ICRC years, etc. So these are very big organizations with, probably in the humanitarian world, those which have the most capacity in terms of security management. These are the organizations that can bring in food in Gaza, or humanitarian medical running hospitals on the front line in Ukraine, etc. But you have really a variety of organizations, of humanitarian organizations, local and international, with very different shapes and forms, and they wouldn't necessarily have the muscle and the strength to actually engage in all these different sort of areas of improvement that you described. And having this level of awareness, of understanding of what are the risks associated to contracting such or such company, how can we improve in terms of the duty of care, as you mentioned? How can we maybe take companies that's a little bit more expensive, but maybe also better in terms of compliance to international standards? And so I think what's going to be really interesting going forward is how we can move forward as a sector. I think we are making progress. I think the report and the research that the ICoCA has done, the GISF has done together is a really important step. And at the same time, and the research showed it, I think the ICoCA and other bodies are far not enough known, let's say, by the sector. And I think, I mean, I'm really looking forward to hear from other panelists, for people in the room, how we can actually move forward, have concrete action, like next steps in a way. Awareness was a really important one for this report, but then how do we incapacitate those organizations that I was mentioning to actually go in the right direction and sort of have the capacity to deal with this sort of engagement?
Yeah, I think, Dave, you said humanitarian actors don't know how to contract with private security actors. That's something.
Yeah, sorry. I think we're trying, but it's a new. It's not a new field, but it's something that's been recognized that we need to improve. and part of that is identifying the motivation of the individuals on the ground. Are they there just for money or a job or whatever? Are they there for, you know, for glory or something like that? Is there something that has been held out by the state? For instance, immunity from, like the Wagner did a lot with offering prisoners immunity once they serve 6 months, and that sort of thing, or the French Foreign Legion is promises after a certain amount of time that you will get French citizenship. So, you know, trying to understand the motivations. I ended up talking with a lot of different guys, and they kind of put it down into 4 categories or 5 categories, which I've listed one of. But one of them also said, well, you know, some people that are in this business, actually more than one, said that, oh yeah, and then there's, well, the impunity, because generally, like even within military, there's you know, some form of justice system in most militaries, and they go, well, if you really screw up in a PMC, you get a ticket home. Generally, you're not prosecuted. So this impunity can sometimes attract people that are sociopaths and things like this. And this, of course, is. It was very funny because a number of them admitted this, but they go, "But it's not me. It's not me." Like, you know, that's a sociopath. But we all know some. So I think trying to determine this is the motivations of the people on the ground is a key factor as well.
Thank you. So it's true that through your presentation there are some kind of elements of how to say typology of private military companies, and also perhaps this could help us in our negotiation strategies, understanding their motivations. I'm very excited about all that, but I realize people may have questions, so I should not be asking all the questions. Now we are going to take questions from your side, so we can take 3.
Can I just follow up just very quickly before we go to questions?
Sure, yes.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much. I mean, just coming back to the negotiation point, I really do think so much work has already been done in developing good CIMIC and SIMCORD engagement strategies. And I mean, this is OCHA do some great work in terms of training and building capacity within the sectors about that. Also developing negotiation strategies, CCH then do some brilliant trainings on that as well. But I think what's really required, and what has come out for me so much over the last few days, and certainly it's coming out in this panel as well, is, and I think that this is probably where I would turn to the other colleagues on the panel who are actually in organisations I feel are quite empowered to do something like this, and ICoCA is too, to actually do the work in terms of the research and disaggregation of what the different organisations are. And I know it's a bloody difficult task, but it's really come out over the last 3 days that needs to be done. And I think until we can actually disaggregate, I'm not saying for me, I just jumped into this sector, I'm not a good example, but there is a risk that the responsible security companies, the people you want to attract into this room, will be very put off by coming here and being called mercenaries, and like this is a real risk, which I believe, I mean, looking at the humanitarian principles, you're talking about impartiality, neutrality, independence of programming and action, and I think by getting people into a room to actually get them to the table, to negotiate with them, to actually engage them and actually improve sectors on a massive scale, will require getting over certain sort of preconceptions and stereotypes. And it is such a big sector that if you don't break that down and you're not actually breaking down those barriers and starting to identify who is who and what is what and what's poor practice, what is the grey zone, then I think until that point is done, then we're going to lose a lot of people along the way. And that's something I'm looking more from my previous life as a humanitarian than I am in my current one. But yeah, sorry.
Absolutely. The need for research and data is coming out very clearly, and the protection of those who collect the data. And we really need to work on that because we have only scattered pieces of information. So definitely it's something which comes out of our discussions. Now, if I know that we could continue, but there are people with questions. So I saw you, perhaps someone else there. Yes? So we have two questions. Yes.
Thanks very much indeed. Una Muirhead from MSS Global, which is, if Gregory thinks his company is boring, then ours is really, really boring because we're the ones who go out and audit Gregory and the other companies. So really, really boring. So look, this has been an absolutely fascinating panel. Thank you so much. When I read what it was about, I thought, well, this is going to be a kind of interesting sort of procedural discussion about, how can we kind of get on the ground engagement between the providers of private security and NGOs, and kind of there'll be some really practical suggestions which come out of it. And of course, there's been nothing like that at all. It's been much more interesting, much more shades of grey. So thinking about the fact that, humanitarian organizations, obviously they're on the ground with the motivation very clear to make people's lives better. Private, the companies that provide security services generally have investors, shareholders, directors, all these kinds of people behind them whose motivation is to enhance the reputation of their company by doing good things well, so that they bring in more, money and commercial, all the rest of it. And that's what a company generally does. I think what we've been talking about is a whole series of really malign actors, I might call proxy, military forces, militias, mercenaries, and all the rest of it. And all of whom have totally, their motivation is down the other end of the scale. And down is the right word, down to Hades. So I just question, does the panel think that actually the real question to be asked is, how can humanitarian organizations and the companies that provide responsible security services, how can they together think about engaging with the militias, the Wagners, the bad malign actors doing bad things with whom they will come in, with whom all of you on the panel will come into contact at some point at another? Should we be thinking about putting ourselves in one bracket and those malign actors in the other bracket, and working together to think, well, if any of us, whether we're a company providing responsible security services or an NGO, come across that example of the checkpoint, how are we going to behave and engage? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have Dalia. You may introduce yourself. Yeah. Then we'll have one more question from Vicky.
Okay, thank you. My name is Dalia. I'm Dalia Sades. I'm a researcher at Queen Mary University, also retired security advisor at Amnesty International. Thank you so much for your contribution. It was really interesting. I'm really happy this conversation is happening. I think maybe a step forward could be to have a security expert who does security for an NGO on the panel next time as well, because I think that is sort of the bridge between all of these topics. And I think one of the things that we seem to do is disconnect the conversation about protection for civilians with protection of people who work for NGOs. And I think actually this two-tiered system is something we need to break down. My question, though, is mainly for Greg. Really interested in sort of the values of your organization. I would love to hear more about it. Is that a pragmatic or a principled decision? As in, do you think the tools that you're using could also be used in the extractive industry, or do you think that once you engage with both industries, kind of the blurring makes it difficult to provide the right type of security for NGOs? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one more question here. Vicky. There. Thank you. And yes, and okay.
Thank you.
All right. So perhaps we'll take these 3 questions and then we'll give you back the.
Thank you. I'm a bit confused by this panel, particularly the apples and oranges, but maybe it can be clarified afterwards, because I do think that you've been talking about different things at the beginning and the end. But my question is not about the malign actors that Una's referring to, but about this concept of humanitarian resistance, which I don't know whether you have been listening to. All of you have got Myanmar connections based on your CV, and it's something which has come up very much within the Myanmar context. The idea that humanitarian resistance is the rescue, relief and protection of people suffering under an unjust enemy regime, specifically organised by individuals and groups who are politically opposed to the regime and support resistance against it. In other words, politicising the humanitarian concept. I was wondering, from the humanitarian side, what do you think of that concept? And from the PSC company side, what's been your experience of negotiating with those groups, both from the perspective of negotiating with the groups, but also the impacts of working with groups who are opposing a regime in the country which you're operating? Thank you. Do you get the question? It's Hugo Slim who came up with this, who was, a great Gurkha, well, rather his father was a great Gurkha man.
Okay, thank you. So let's address those questions first. Who would like to start?
You've got the mic next to me, but I don't want to jump in. No, thank you very much. I happen to know Hugo better than his dad, actually, because my wife used to work with him. But I'll take your question first, and I think they're both actually quite interlinked. The ethics around it, about this type of work. And I think a lot of people would probably look at me up here and think, oh, he's sold out, he's gone to the dark side. And maybe I'm wrong, but I do not see it that way at all. The organization I work for now has as strong as ethics as any organization I've ever worked with, which includes the UN and includes INGOs. We've got far more, thanks to MSS Global as well and ICoCA, we've got far more people looking at us and scrutinizing us to make sure that we work incredibly well, at least in terms of meeting the requirements that we have to meet through the audit. And we hold ourselves to a very high ethical standard. The company itself was created to fill a void, to fill a gap, to try and present both good employment opportunities for people who are leaving the military because they came from the Gurkhas, but also with the agenda, the guy who started it, he wanted to try and support in some way the humanitarian development sector. And I think people need to sort of understand to an extent as well that the people working in this industry are professionals, and they usually come from a certain type of background, and they want to sort of continue doing that sort of work, but that doesn't mean they have to go and join a military affiliate or a mercenary group or anything like that. There are lots of quite principled ways to continue providing the knowledge that you've developed over many, many years working in the security sector, and I think this is a good way to do that. What I would really say as well is we are a very small company and have made some really, really tricky decisions. I only joined in June, but we've made some really tricky decisions since then as well to not take on contracts. And I think a lot of the bigger companies should probably look at that as well. And the bigger you get, the more expensive your operations, the more questionable it may be that you are maintaining that approach throughout. And I think, there's some great big security companies, but they need to be very careful. And I'm sure they're as much aware of that as anyone. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but moving on to Vicky's as well. But we, at least IDG, have learned very much from the humanitarian sector. I'm bringing in my own background here as well, but we have a principled approach. Independence, impartiality wherever we can, neutrality, and much like you do in the processes that you go through to try and decide if we're going to engage with certain actors or not, is something that we've done in Myanmar. And I don't want to go into discussing our operations there, but we don't talk to any of the armed groups. We don't talk to any of the government affiliates. The only reason we would talk to the government is to try and make sure we've got the licensing and accreditation we need to actually still maintain our work and get visas for staff, etc. But wherever possible, we minimize that as well. And so we really try and maintain the independence and impartiality. And no, we're not a humanitarian organization, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from a lot of those key elements. I shall pass this down.
Yeah, as far as, first of all, most of the examples we've been giving are the difficult ones. But just to be fair, you know, that we had a kidnapping, and we engage with a very reputable company to provide advice. And they did a great job in this one kidnapping, because the guy said right away when the first call came in from the perpetrators, he said, these guys are amateurs. So you have a whole different group of risks, and he went through them for us. And it would have taken us much more time to realize that. So this expertise was critical in resolving the kidnapping in just a few days. So there's many examples of sort of the humanitarian world working hand in hand with professionals, and so I, like I say, but there's so many different groups, and then there's confusion sometimes, because sometimes some of these companies are actually doing humanitarian work themselves, like in this sort of where you hearts and minds operations or whatever, and they're being contracted for that. So that we probably could spend the whole day just on this topic, because it's so convoluted.
I wanted to come back to your comment about engaging with malign companies, you know, private military companies, and that's where I think there's a big difference between, you know, the humanitarian sector and the commercial sectors. Normally, we should not call anyone malign among the armed actors that we have to deal with as humanitarians, because sometimes you have to deal with them on a very long term, you know, and you know that they have a long list of record, you know, that is at the UN Security Council, but you still have to engage, or you want to engage with them because they control a territory where most of the people are suffering, and that's where I think that's one thing. How we qualify those groups that are the PMCs that you qualify as malign. That's one thing, and then the second thing is that if we engage with them, you know, we want to do it. It's not on commercial base. It's not on interest base. It's really based on the needs of the population there. So there is no, I think. There is no. The main issue, as I was saying, it's about what is the transparency that is given by each of the security providers. So for Gregory's company, maybe they are more transparent, they are more open to that, you know. But then other companies are not as transparent. And I think it's not necessarily on the companies, but it's also on their mandators, mostly the governments. And here I'm talking about military companies, private military companies, and not necessarily security companies. Another subject.
Cool, thanks. If I may add, there was a suggestion whether to consult the good companies, good PMCs, to engage bad PMCs, which is in theory is a really good idea. We get the good guys, we work with them, and we commit to a better good. But in the end, it puts us in a very vulnerable position, because most of the time the PMCs deployed in specific area, they are working on behalf, well, either from specific state that has been deploying them there, or they're working with the state there or organization there, which working directly with any side, with any PMC, it compromises our principles. It puts us on the side of making us side of the conflict in a way. So there is a lot of work being done consulting with these organizations, informally asking for advice, but it would be extremely complicated for humanitarian actors to be one front with PMCs, even for a greater idea of engaging another group that is an obstacle for humanitarian operation.
Sorry, that wasn't my suggestion. My suggestion is that we're all in the same boat. You know, we're on one side of the...
When you use the word PMC, do you mean PMC or PSC?
Yes.
When you said good PMCs, do you actually mean PSCs?
This is why we need to define it. We have to define it. It's so important.
No, we consciously we have included in this discussion the negotiation with PMCs, or private military companies, and the humanitarian consequences they produce in conflict situations. But we've also included in the discussion sometimes the question of humanitarian actors contracting private security companies. So that's why we have those two topics being discussed here. But we should distinguish them
I think the
clearly.
title of the thing was PSCs, though, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't make it. Don't make it harder.
Yeah, no, just to follow up on this, and I guess we're going to close soon. I think with the conversation we are having here is exactly the reason why we need to have education and awareness raising on both sides. Because I think the people which are on this panel today are certainly some of the people the most aware of what a PSC, what a PMC, what is private, what private security actors do on the ground in the humanitarian sector. And you are probably as you were saying, the good guys, the most advanced in terms of what is a good behavior and appropriate behavior and how to engage with civil society actors and humanitarian NGOs on the ground. But the vast majority of our respective industries actually don't have a clue. And indeed, as a humanitarian actor, our core business is to help populations being affected on the ground by all sorts of actors, security actors, including PMCs. And at the same time, we have our own security management, and we need to resort to PSPs, private security providers, for our own security management. And we have risks which are different, which needs to be addressed, which needs to be assessed, which we need in-depth assessment for all of this. But you actually, these are distinctions which are, for us, I mean, we are handling this, juggling with these balls as easily as we can. But for the vast majority of our respective sectors, it's a challenge. So I think to your suggestion, I think it's a great suggestion. And at the same time, I was thinking, I'm a policy engagement person, so how could we do this? We would need to really have separately efforts being done in our two respective communities to raise this awareness and that understanding and that mapping of who are the guys that want to speak with us, and how we can have a meaningful dialogue and being the good guys, kind of putting some brain powers on this question, let's say, to try and find good ideas to moving forward.
Thank you very much. So we are now getting late, so we have one last question or remark. I'm sorry, that would be Michelle, and then perhaps the last response.
No, thank you so much, and I'll be brief. One, I really want to thank you for this forum because it really has been elucidating for me. It's been very eye-opening because I really had not seen and had not heard about kind of the fear or the resistance on the part of NGOs, civil society, humanitarian organizations, where it comes to where they are meeting with private security services companies. So, a little bit, it's distressing to hear that because I don't think we're the bad guys. I think we're the good guys. But this discussion has caused me to know I've got to go back and revisit our training, right? That particularly for my company, I want to go back and revisit the training. We can't just be, whether it's guard force orders, entry control points, all the things that comprise a comprehensive turnkey security solution that my company is hired to provide. We can't just be focusing in that new hire training on all of those elements and not be considering also our obligations and responsibilities to represent the mission well, right? I mean, at one point, I think 2 days ago, Jamie talked to us about all PSC members here at ICoCA, our roles as ambassadors. Well, you can drive that down to the specific level of a guard also, and we should. We need to make sure that when we are in docking, whether it's third country nationals, local nationals, sending U.S. personnel, that they understand the mission, that they understand the client, that they understand the privilege of the mission, and who they're representing when they are protecting at an entry control point, when they are driving the client around somewhere, that they need to reflect the very best of this industry and also who their end user is. So I'm going to go back and take a look at our guard force orders, some of our training, see if I can sit through some of it and see how it is we in-dock personnel properly so that they improve their communication skills, because that's kind of part of what I heard, is that they need to be communicating effectively, decently, civilly, even as they execute the work, the security services work they have, or the entry control point, so that there's not fear there, which is what some of you described. And then the second thing, going back to yesterday, because we had this talk on gender, I wanted to ask all of you, of course, this is a very male-dominated industry, and we hire a lot of male security guards, but would some of your fears or worries or just sense of anxiety, could some of that be addressed if we all work as industry works to increase the percentage of women on guard force contracts? Thank you.
Can I just point out a point between PMCs and PSCs, because I'm a PSC owner. Can you use the mic? Yes. Because this is hitting a little bit of a nerve, because we're not a private military company. It comes down to the rules for use of force. So a private military company will use different rules of engagement as what a private security company will. And we can influence what that looks like through training and enforce that across all of our projects. Private military companies, you cannot influence their rules for the use of force, whereas we have autonomy to a certain extent, depending on the legal operating framework, to alter our rules of engagement to make sure we preserve life and all those other good principles that I'm sure have been discussed over the last 2 or 3 days.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, perhaps one quick answer to Michel, or?
Yes, if I may.
Yes, please.
I think that what you just said, I would say that the communication channels are very open, with the PSCs and the PMCs. So I think it would be good to reach out to the official channels like OCHA, for example. You have also many INGO platforms in each country that you can reach out. If you make the first step, of course, it will dissipate a lot of the different mysteries and fears that can have. And of course, I think also to have a representation of better women in your teams also, that would be very helpful, not necessarily for the INGOs or NGOs, but also for the civilian populations to see a bit more of a diversity.
Thank you. This is one more panel where we cannot reach a conclusion, but I see lots of needs for data, needs for clarification sometimes, needs for mutual understanding between the humanitarian sector and the private security actors. Definitely need for the humanitarian actors to know how to negotiate with those private military actors. Need for humanitarian actors also to really do a proper assessment when they contract a company and ensure due diligence. So lots of needs and lots of further discussions, I think, because we've just started it. So thank you all, and now we have a break. One
short question from Ukraine.
Yes.
Dina. I'm representative of Ukrainian PSC, affiliate member of ICoCA. And in Ukraine we have our training facilities and engage in different missions, advisory and security advisory and accompanying missions. So all we discussed today is very interesting in worldwide also for us, because we have staffs outsourcing all over the world. And I think that the practical outcome of this forum and discussion would be nice to have some guidance, training materials, and let's say sharing experience and putting this into some kind of guidance for all of us, so that we can gain from this and apply it locally in different countries, based on our mutual experience from each other country that you have, from Africa, from Ukraine, from other countries, so we can apply especially also these issues with gender stuff, because for some countries it is will be in favor, or for some countries not in favor. So these general standards and practices that we have to embed it in some kind of tutorial and training material, so that we can benefit all of them in future. How do you think, should we expect in the closest time these materials or trainings? Thank you.
Thank you for this point. ICoCA has developed some materials for humanitarian organizations to contract private security companies. So please get back to us on that, because we have materials. We have also this research produced by ICoCA and GISF. So thanks for this. Yes, please all come back at 4 for the last panel. Thank you.